Well, Rod Martin's done it again. He's produced yet another video, this time claiming to expose the global warming lie that the current rate of global warming is dangerous. This is my response to his video, showing where the truth of the matter really lies. Let's first go over some of Martin's main points. He seems to think that the current rate of warming is slower than past warmings. He believes that trying to stop climate change is delusional, that we are in fact heading for a new little ice age because the sun is going to go into a new grand solar minimum, and therefore we should prepare for cooling, not warming. Martin starts off by trivializing the amount of warming that we're going to get from the effects of global warming. He does this by comparing the day and night temperatures for a given city, in this case Los Angeles, saying that the average range between day and night is about 10 degrees centigrade, and that's much larger than the amount of global warming we can expect. So anybody can climatize to that small difference. Now he's forgetting here a couple of things. First of all, day-night cycles are in fact cycles. They're not a trend. A trend will add to this. The other thing he's forgetting is that there's a range of high temperatures during the day in LA, and it can get as high as the mid-90s at times. So what happens when you add 3 or 4 degrees centigrade to that, and then put the range in, assuming that it doesn't get yet larger again, you can get up to 42 degrees centigrade in LA. Now remember what happened to the heat wave in Europe? France alone lost 15,000 people due to heat-related illnesses, and there the temperatures only got to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is something you cannot trivialize. This can actually be a matter of life and death. Next, Martin shows us this plot, which is supposed to prove that the current warming is a lot slower than anything we've seen in the past. There's quite a few things wrong with this plot. Let me go into some of them. First of all, it's for Greenland only. GISP2 is at the very peak of the Greenland ice cap and subject to much larger temperature swings than the rest of the planet. Now, the other thing I noticed is this green bar here that was labeled modern warm period seemed to be quite broad to me, so I compared it with the overall scale of 11,000 years. It turns out this is a 250-year wide band, which would put us back in the middle of the little ice age. So this band being too wide would give the appearance that the modern warming is much slower than it actually is. He also doesn't have all the data on here. If you put the point for 2009 on here, there it is up the top right hand corner. If I put the point for 2018, it would actually be off this chart. So let's put in a line connecting the last data that's valid on this plot to the 2009 point, and there's the warming rate that we see. Now this is much more persistent and steep than anything we have on this plot to date, including the time when we were coming out of the previous interglacial 10,500 years ago. So the current warming is much faster than anything we've seen during the Holocene. Trick alert! Note Martin started off the video talking about warming or global warming. But at about 2.5 minutes into the video, he switches to climate change, so he can claim that the climate is always changing. But the term global warming and climate change are not synonymous. Global warming is a type of climate change. Climate change can be in a local area, it can be a change in temperature, precipitation, wind direction, ocean currents, many other things. Global warming refers to the average increase in global temperatures over the last 50 to 100 years. So I don't know why people like Martin have to resort to such tricks in order to make their case, if their case is as strong as they claim it is. We need a reality check here. Martin claims that if you're trying to stop climate change, you're deluded. Well, that's just another example of a straw man argument that he used before. A straw man argument being where you assign a particular statement to your opponents and then argue against it to discredit them. Nobody is arguing that we're trying to stop the climate from changing. That's not possible, at least at the moment. And it's not altogether clear that it would be desirable to do so. We're trying to stop the Earth from warming any more due to our emissions of greenhouse gases and aerosols, and putting the climate into a state that's not conducive to most of the life forms that currently exist. That's the crux of the matter. This next point is rather trivial, but it just shows how scientifically clueless Martin can be. He mentions that the mammoths were killed off at the beginning of the Holocene. He said it could be due to warming, but we don't actually know. It could have been a meteor impact. Now, I'm sure most of you know that meteors don't ever hit the ground. They burn up in the atmosphere at about 70 kilometers altitude. He might have meant meteorites, which are small rocks that do actually make it to the ground, but they would have been directed at these poor mammoths and have killed them off individually and not affected anything else, which makes mammoths the single most unlucky creatures in the universe. What he probably meant was an asteroid or comet impact, but there's no evidence of such an impact at the time of the beginning of the Holocene. And there's nothing in the literature about impact events affecting the creatures at the beginning of the Holocene. So first of all, he's obviously not checked the scientific literature, so he just made up something to be an alternative to global warming. Now the theories basically say it was increases in global temperature and human hunting of these particular creatures that eventually killed them off. But there's no reason to make stuff up, as Martin is doing, just to try to make his point, hoping that nobody would check. I'll put it like this: I'm going to check. He next shows us this plot and claims that we're over the hill. We're going down into the next little ice age. Now, first of all, this is the satellite data, which doesn't measure surface temperature. It measures temperatures approximately 4 kilometers in altitude, so which is lots less sensitive to global warming effects than the lower levels of the atmosphere or the surface, which is why, of course, he's using this data. But what he's pointing out is that since 2016, there's been a major decline in global temperatures at that altitude. Now, what he doesn't mention is that the 2016 period was during a major El Nino, and now we're in a La Nina event, which is a cooling event. So you'd expect a decline in temperature. So we're not necessarily going down to a new little ice age, because we've had many of these before. None of them have resulted in a new little ice age. In fact, all the time we've had all these little downward trends that you could point to, the overall trend has been up. So this particular projection is, of course, nonsense. Martin then claims we've had record cold, showing pictures of snow-covered London buses and snow in the desert. Well, let's check that out. One way of doing this is looking at the record daily highs and the record daily lows over the last year. In that time, we've had about 108,000 record daily highs to only 47,700 record daily lows. We could do the same thing on a monthly basis, and you have 5,600 record highs to 1,000 record lows. That's a ratio of 5 to 1. And all-time records, which are very hard to set, you have 376 record highs to 48 record lows. That's a ratio of 7 to 1. Now, if you had a stable climate system, this would be approximately 1 to 1. But if you have more record highs than lows, then it's a warming planet. If you have more record lows than highs, it's a cooling planet. And these figures indicate that we have a very strongly warming planet. Martin engages yet another sleight of hand here. He shows us this plot and claims that there's only been 0.9 degrees centigrade warming in the last 100 years. But let's actually take a look at his plot and see what that says. I've put a box between the highest and lowest points on this curve and read off the value on the left-hand axis. And I make that 0.45 degrees centigrade to 0.7 degrees centigrade, which is 1.15 degrees centigrade. So he's understated the amount of warming. But that's not all he's done. He hasn't shown us all the data. This plot only goes through to 2014. We've got 3 more years worth of data on here that he hasn't used. I wonder why. Let's take a look. Oh, that's why. This is the bit he showed us. The next 3 years are much, much warmer. And so if you take the maximum minimum limits there, the warming has been 1.4 degrees centigrade over that century. And so consequently, he's understated the warming by about 50%. Next, he tries another trick, switching from surface measurements to satellite data. And the satellite data measures temperatures at about 4 kilometers altitude, which is far less sensitive to global warming than the surface is. This plot goes through to 2018. Strange that, because he wants to include this cooling trend that he talked about before in the plot to reduce the slope of the warming. He claims that the warming is 0.0117 degrees, but he doesn't mention that's per year. So in a decade, that's 0.12 degrees centigrade, which is exactly what RSS and UAH have said it has been all along. So this is no new news at all. At long last, he gets something right. He says that you can't take a short-term trend and project it on and expect to get a good result. I couldn't agree more. He then went on to say that the news media predicted an ice age as a result. Who cares what the news media said? They're not scientists. What did the scientists say? They published papers on this, and we can look back at those papers, and in that time period there were 42 papers about global warming. There was only 7 papers about global cooling, and most of those global cooling papers were about long-term Milankovitch cycles, not imminent ice ages. So the scientists got it right back then, and they're getting it right now. Here's another example of Martin getting the science completely wrong. He states the solar wind at solar minimum will decrease down to nothing, letting in more cosmic rays, which will create more clouds and plunge the Earth into a new little ice age. Here is the strength of the solar wind, the speed of the solar wind at solar minimum on the left and solar maximum on the right. And as you can see, the average speed of the solar wind during minimum is greater than that during solar maximum on the right. So his point is completely wrong. In fact, the issue with the cosmic rays is the strength of the solar magnetic field, which decreases at solar minimum compared with solar maximum. Remember this picture that he showed at the beginning of his video, when he was arguing that the range of increase due to global warming was small to the day compared to the daily range of temperatures in Los Angeles, California? Well, you could actually turn that argument around. You could say that the cooling from the daytime high to the nighttime low is 10 degrees of cooling. And when you compare that to the difference between an interglacial and a glacial period which is 4 to 7 degrees centigrade, that's much smaller than the 10 degrees centigrade as well. And so consequently, you shouldn't be worrying about global cooling. But he seems to worry an awful lot about global cooling, but not by the equivalent amount of global warming. I wonder why. So finally, let's see what the science says. This is from an IPCC report. The climate has changed on all timescales throughout Earth's history. Some aspects of the current climate change are not unusual, but others are. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has reached a record high relative to more than the past 500,000 years, and has done so at an exceptionally fast rate. Current global temperatures are warmer than they have ever been during the last 5 centuries, probably even more than a millennium. If warming continues unabated, the resulting climate change within this century would be extremely unusual in geological terms. Another unusual aspect of recent climate change is its cause. Past climate changes were natural in origin, whereas most of the warming of the past 50 years is attributable to human activities. That's pretty definitive, wouldn't you say? But that report was written in 2000. Since then, we've added another half a degree to that warming. And you could ask whether that is dangerous or not. But there's 15,000 people in France that would probably agree with you if they weren't dead. The World Health Organization estimates that 50,000 people each year are dying as a result of global warming. You could ask the creatures that are going extinct or are threatened as a result of climate change. But then it'd be rather difficult because most of them are dead. But I think if they weren't, they would agree that climate change is pretty dangerous. So I find that the trivialization of climate change by Mr. Martin is bordering on disgusting. And I wonder who's paying him to put out this rubbish.